You're listening to the Saving Elephants podcast, a place where millennials express and defend their conservative values in hopes of restoring the Republican Party. Join us as we reignite conservatism for millennials.
This episode of Saving Elephants will be a little different. Instead of focusing on American conservatism, we will be taking a look at Chinese authoritarianism. I am your host, Josh Lewis, and I, for one, believe the ordered liberty we have enjoyed all of our lives here in the United States is something that we are always at risk of taking for granted. And it's important to understand how most of the rest of the world has lived and how many still live today. That the American Republic, democratic liberal institutions, the rule of law and limited government, that these things are not just natural and they don't just spring up by accident. And when a people has them, they ought to jealously guard them. There are obviously many examples throughout the world today of authoritarian regimes, but I recently encountered on YouTube the channel All Things China with Lu. Lu is a Chinese dissident who performs on YouTube what she calls cultural forensics. She was born and raised in China, and she's used her deep roots and research background to read between the lines of global media and propaganda. I really find a lot of her videos interesting because they explain what we Westerners would often miss about China and the Chinese Communist Party in particular. And so I wanted to have Lu on to have a conversation about her knowledge and experience with China, what exactly we Westerners are missing. And I really think throughout the course of the conversation, it will become clear how a deep understanding of an authoritarian regime helps elucidate what it means to live in a free society and just what it is we American conservatives are trying to conserve. So with that, I give you my conversation with Lu.
You're listening to the Saving Elephants Show.
Lu, there's a lot I could ask you about China, but I want to start here. What is one of the major things or thing that Westerners just don't understand about China?
That's a really good question. I think there are a lot of things that Westerners don't understand about China. First, there's the language perspective. There are a lot of, I cover this a little bit in my channel. There are a lot of people in China who understand English, but there aren't a lot of the so-called China experts. And I know a lot of professional China experts and even like correspondence reporters in China, they do not speak the language. But I think more importantly, a lot of people don't understand the culture and don't understand how fundamentally the regime is different. They function in a very different way. They're not a government, the Chinese Communist Party. So the Chinese government is not really a government in the sense most people in the democratic world understand. They're really truly an organization with this autocrat on the top. And then there's a lot of cultural misunderstandings that only people like me, people who actually grew up in that culture, would understand. There's just so much, but I think language and just the governance are the two main things that a lot of Westerners misunderstand.
Do the Chinese think of China as being a very separate thing from the CCP, or are they sort of seen as the same thing?
People in China, we grew up being taught that they are the same. They're, the Chinese, it's actually built into our textbook, which is mandatory for all students in China, unless you're super privileged and you go to a private school, and we don't have a lot of private schools at all. So we grew up, I was taught that the Chinese Communist Party is the only and the right choice for the Chinese people. And until I went abroad, I never realized you can actually vote your leader. You can actually have more than just one party, not just on paper, not theoretically, not for like performance, but actually an opposition party. I never thought that was a thing. I was so shocked. I remember when I was at J school, I was just so shocked how the Western world is different, but people in China, we believe, at least we have to, we're taught that way. We believe the Chinese Communist Party equals the Chinese government equals the country, and you have to pledge your loyalty to the party, and that means you're a good person and you are loyal to your country.
And I know you and I have talked about this in our pre-conversation, but you're ethnically, you're
Mhm.
Han Chinese.
I am.
And that is something that even though I know a little about the mindset, my Western brain has a hard time with this. So help me out here in the sense that the CCP, as I understand it, or China sees themselves as, gosh, I don't want to use the wrong words, but almost that they own you because you are
No,
ethnically there. Is that putting it too strongly?
no, I wish that was an exaggeration. It's not. I mean, when you live in an authoritarian regime, everybody is up for grab, right? Like it's very dehumanizing. And it doesn't mean that we as a culture is any inferior, but it's just this way of thinking that was imposed on us. It's very dehumanizing. So, and when you want to control a large population, which is what the Chinese Communist Party wants, they do use your race, your origin, your Han Chinese, and I don't know. It's just very dehumanizing. You are a piece of property, and I think I grew up in that culture. I'm used to that. The thing is, it's kind of like it's probably a bad example, an analogy, but it's kind of like you living with an abusive partner, and that's all you know. You don't realize it's abusive, it's dehumanizing, but that's just the way that we grow up.
So let me press on that a little because I'm trying to think here again from a Western mindset. If a fellow American of mine um, were to move overseas and denounce their United States citizenship, they would in effect not be American anymore. And I recognize maybe what you're doing is a little different, but you present yourself as a Chinese dissident, right? You are opposed to the CCP, yet you are still ethnically Han Chinese.
Hmm.
So the CCP, if I'm not mistaken, still feels that it owns you in a sense, like in spite of the fact that you've left. It's like, but you
Absolutely.
can't get away from your ethnicity. Like this is who you are.
Yeah, absolutely. And it just doesn't stop here. It doesn't stop at people like me. I'm a first generation immigrant in North America. Even if you're a second generation immigrant living in Canada, you were born here, maybe you've never been to China, they still, in a way, they think they project some sort of power on you. And this is not just me saying that, it's very well documented. Um, there this Chinese Canadian reporter, she has a book where she interviews people in Canada when she was reporting in Canada. They talk about how the subjects and people that she interviewed for various stories, they talk about how the Chinese Communist Party are kind of ruthless when it comes to their influence campaigns operated in Canada, and they see the color of your skin, and they see that you're a second-gen immigrant. They feel like they can do things to you. It's just a very bizarre mindset that I'm still like, I find it hard to grasp. I can't imagine how people in the West would understand that, but it's totally true. They do. I mean, they threaten our Chinese politician, right? Like Chinese Canadian politician. Um, so I think that's evident enough.
And in your videos, obviously, you do a lot of work, I think, that sort of portrays this at a very granular
Yeah.
level of individuals. And I want to talk about some of those, but before I stray
Hmm.
too far from the broad topic beginning off with here, outside of the fact that I think it's fair to say the CCP desires to maintain its control and power in China, but beyond that, what does it want? What is the long-term goal of the government of China?
Well, that's that's a really good question. I think there are millions of answers to that question. If you ask I guess, a China watcher, they would give you a different answer. I think ultimately they do want power, and long term, to be able to have the power that the autocrats in China want so desperately. They want to change your perspective. They want to change your perspective of global politics, about the regime, so that the eventual rise of China seems inevitable and right. And when China gains more power globally, I think there's this misunderstanding that China is this peaceful player on the global stage, that they just want to be left alone. They just want to be an authoritarian regime to their own people, but that's just so not true. They want power globally. And I think they might say they don't want it, but if you look at their actions, look at their global projects like the Belt and Road, and I think you realize that they really want to eventually replace the democratic world order led by the U.S. And when China first joined the WTO, they were very shy about it. But I think what we see in recent years, especially after Xi Jinping took power, their ambition is harder to hide.
Mm. So, and again, I want to unpackage that just a little because I think Americans, at least if you look back at the Cold War, have in mind the notion of a rogue rival world power, let's say. In our brains, that looks like the Soviet Union. And they had maybe a clearer outside goal, if you will, of global communism, right? I mean, they would straight up say, America will fall without a shot being fired because it'll be completely surrounded by communist countries and they will be the last to fall in a sense.
Mm.
And the Red Army had a terrible habit of showing up in neighboring countries and just sort of parking there and constantly expand the borders in a way that, again, we Americans, I think, don't think China does. Now, to be fair, I understand we've got Tibet, you've got, threats of Taiwan, of course, you've got the Uyghurs. Obviously, there have been, and the South Chinese Seas, there's obviously been some expansionary occupations or attempts. But when you talk about kind of the global order, I guess what I have in my mind is not so much that the risk is that China would seize territories all over the world, but rather that they would seek to dominate economically, politically, militarily, and replace Western nations in that role. Is that is that a fair way to put it?
Yeah, it's a great way to put it, because I think China doesn't want the rule-based order. They don't like the idea that there's a limit to its power. And the smart thing that I think they've done is they understand to change that dynamic, they have to start from people's values. And in a democratic world, I mean, you guys can vote. So how you perceive China matters more, probably even more than how Chinese people actually perceive China. Because if you look around, China's economy is not doing very well. There are a lot of people that are angry about the regime, but they can't vote. They can't do anything about it. So China really does understand very well that changing your perspective really matters. And it's a means to their goal, which is, yeah, to replace that world order. It might come in a different form. I think we're already in an information war against China that they started. It might not manifest in a way of like territory grab, except for Taiwan, but they definitely do want to change what we have right now.
Well, let's talk about Taiwan. And I'm not, I would ask this of, say, like an American, someone who has a strategic viewpoint or has studied military history or something like that, ask them the question, why should we care about Taiwan? But I want to ask you, as a Chinese dissident, should the West care about Taiwan? And if so, why? Why is it in our interest to care about Taiwan?
As a Chinese dissident, Taiwan is a beacon of hope. There's this stereotype that Chinese people are not, democracy is not suitable for us. Even among Chinese people ourselves, like there's this stereotype that we are not meant to have a democracy. And Taiwan is a living example of the opposite belief. They have a very, admittedly, very messy democracy right now. I mean, it's kind of terrible, but
Right.
still, it's a democracy. People vote, and it's so much better than what Chinese people have right now. Um, so I think to be able to maintain that, to be able to maintain an independent, democratic Taiwan is important for dissidents like me, but also for the rest of us. What do we stand up for? What do we believe in? Taiwan is an example of, you can actually have a better world. You can have something better, even if you probably like China's authoritarian regime for a long, long time, but you can still choose to have a democracy. And I think that really matters to people because it is a time when people could use a little bit more hope.
I think I mean, we hear this all the time that democratic nations and authoritarian regimes can't really be neighbors, right? Or at least if they can, there needs to be some sort of cultural barrier beyond that. And I think that's why China struggled with Hong Kong and Taiwan. I think it's why Russia struggles with Ukraine. It can't abide a democratic, thriving neighbor. And one thing that, back in the 2016 election here in the United States, there was an awful lot of, I'm not trying to open a whole can of worms here, but I know the listeners know what I'm talking about. A lot of allegations that Russia was putting its thumb on the scale of the 2016 elections, a lot of misinformation being spread around.
Heard of that?
But yes, and there was a whole investigation. I'm not trying to get into that necessarily, but what I do think is interesting, I think it is undeniable that Russia did try to make some impact in the election. Now, I don't go so far as to say that Donald Trump was, in cahoots with Vladimir Putin and that they had worked something out and stole the election from Hillary. I don't go that far. But something I had heard at the time, a Russian watcher, it may have been distant, I don't remember, he's an authority on Russia, he made this point. He says, the purpose of the Putin regime in trying to spread this misinformation in the United States is not chiefly to determine who wins the election. Rather, it is so that Russians will get the idea that American democracy is messy, chaotic, unpredictable, and something that is inferior to the system that they have. And I guess I'm asking this in a way because, and probably as you get older in China, learning things, you learn different things about it. But it sounded like you at a young age were impressed with this whole notion of an opposition party was news to you, that this thing could even exist. But to what extent within China, if it is acknowledged, is it seen as, yes, that's how part of the world lives, and thank God we don't, because it's so messy and unpredictable, and we have a far better system here?
Oh God, I'm so glad you said all of that. Um, because it's such a critical part of the propaganda that we receive as Chinese people. When I talk about the cognitive warfare that authoritarian regimes wage against its own people and the rest of the world, I think the fact that they want you to believe that their system is superior. That is why you see all these TikToks about the fast trains, the great infrastructure. That's not just for the dictators. It's mainly for display to establish to just kind of the subtle messaging that what you have is bad, what we have is better, and to make you lose hope of democracy. I mean, heard crazy stories about how Americans thought Russia was better or China was better, and then they're moving here, and then they've, I guess I can swear, but like, you mess around and you'll find out that it's really, really bad.
Yeah.
But I think the fact that people believe that is just so scary. And I hate to say this, Chinese people do believe that. There's a lot of people who drink that Kool-Aid, we're better, even though I don't know, they're probably earning a few $1,000s a year salary. But they still believe that because, I mean, when you don't have a choice to leave, people adjust their perception to feel better, right? So a lot of Chinese people, when they realize this is it, they will never be able to leave this country, to be able to make peace with themselves, they would choose to believe what they have right now is better. And the system, this all-powerful propaganda machine, capitalizes on that. They're counting on the people who gave up, who would rather, sleep than facing the truth, the hard truth. So they try to convince people.
So let me play devil's advocate. I'm going to press back on that just a little bit from a average Chinese perspective. When they say, "Well, we are better," I mean, there is some ways in which I think you could say they are certainly better off than maybe a past version of the country. I mean, we're past the Cultural Revolution, we're past mass starvation, we're past and there's a sense in which China has embraced I don't know what you want to call it, but a quasi-capitalistic order that has elevated, thank God, Chinese people from, grinding poverty and starvation to at least a life where they can, kind of make it. Now, and rightly you say, the economy's faltered. It's not perfect. It's not comparable to the West, but it's better than what they had. And so is there a sense in which the CCP trades on that, saying, look at all the prosperity we have brought?
It's I think it's their legitimacy, right? Like, well, in their mind, that's what makes them a legitimate government, because we made you rich, to put it simply. There are a few things that I take issues with that argument. One is that the Chinese Communist Party was the party that put us in that extreme poverty in the first place.
Right.
So if it wasn't for them, we wouldn't have to go through all of this to get where we are today. We would have been a lot better when you think about that. The second part is the reason that we were able to, I guess, in their party language, they liberated the people or the economy, was because they abandoned what they agreed on with, I guess, like communism is what they believed in. The reason that we were able to, I guess, get richer is because we took some of the capitalist elements in our economy. And now we're seeing the opposite, right? Like now we're seeing the country kind of scaling back to what it was. And we see the collapse of the economy. We see the slowdown. We see we see the opposite. So like, I am not so optimistic about this change. I know this change was temporary. A lot of people believed that China was, and I grew up in the open and reform age of the country. It was arguably the most open period of Chinese modern history. But that was just temporary. It was not because China believed it was good for the people. It was good for the party. Because if they didn't change, if they didn't abandon part of that stupid communism strategy, they wouldn't be able to govern the country. So here's another analogy, I guess. It's like someone robbed you of $1,000, and then they realize you're really angry and they give you $100 back.
Mm-hmm.
Would you still say that person is a good person, or like he is a good person to get in business with? I think a lot of people would say no. And I feel like essentially that's what the Chinese Communist Party to the Chinese people. And it's so sad because I hear a lot of politicians, like I actually watched an interview with the conservative opposition leader in Canada. He went on in the interview, and the first thing when he was asked about China was that the first thing he said was how it's a great civilization. People were lifted from poverty. I'm like, yeah, but with great caveat, like who put us there?
Mm-hmm.
But I understand that's a popular argument.
Sure. And like I said, I just want to, in light of because I think it's important to have conversations in which we are addressing the arguments that show up in people's minds, because I think it is needful we understand how important and how dangerous, so let me turn then to a little bit of history. Let's see if we can cram 3, 4, 5,000 years of history into about 5 minutes here. No, we're not even gonna go that far back. Let's talk about at the beginning of the Communist Party. And I'm asking this because I think from a Western perspective, my suspicion is the average American has this idea in mind that Mao was bad and a lot of people starved. But China is nothing like North Korea. Yes, it's authoritarian. Yes, you might get in trouble if you speak out against the state. But it's by and large, it's a also, I don't want to say civilized, but let's say a prosperous nation state. That's a totally legit way of doing things. And heck, maybe they got some good ideas that we need to borrow. And so, and we can skip up to today, but I wanted to start here. Tell me about the Cultural Revolution. This nice sounding thing. Help me understand just how evil that actually was.
Oh God. Um it is a very hard subject. I get a little bit emotional when I think about it because there's so much we still don't know during that period, and a lot of the history is spoken history. It's extreme cruelty that you probably most people cannot imagine. Was seen. I When I was researching that period, I saw just the most cruel way of torture. I don't know, maybe you need to cut this out, but like in Chinese language, modern language, we have a slang. If someone is really excited, we say that you inject. Did you inject chicken blood? Like to as a way of saying, oh, you're so excited, like you're so jumpy and all that. I didn't realize until I did a little bit of research, but it was actually true. The origin of that was actually from the Cultural Revolution because people did inject chicken blood into other human beings to see them act in a very crazy way, to torture them, to humiliate them. And that's just a tip of an iceberg. And there's a lot of family members, they turn on each other. We're not just talking about cruelty between strangers, we're talking about people betraying each other, wives, husbands, family members. And funny enough, Xi Jinping is actually a product of that period. So he actually personally experienced betrayal by family members, and I imagine extreme cruelty. He doesn't have a trustworthy biography, but I imagine if you live in that period, you must have at least have witnessed some cruelty happening. And the sadder part, I think what's even sadder than just the cruelty committed by people is the lesson that some people took from that was not to how do we prevent this from happening again, but to how do we come on top of this when it happens next. That's how they heal. And I've seen China watchers say that personally Xi Jinping is doing just that because of his childhood experience, childhood trauma. He so desperately wants to make sure that he has all the power. So next time when that happens, he's not going to be the one that's being tortured and being betrayed. He's going to be the person that's calling all the shots.
It's hard to ask a follow-up question to that. It's such a heavy topic, but I think it's important. It's needful we talk about this. And I'm reminded, Sarah, the historian Sarah Payne, who we both watch her videos, and she had talked about the degree to which Mao had used, I don't want to call them children, but young men, I guess, as part of his cultural army as shock troops. That these boys, in a sense, or near young men, were given the power and authority they'd never had over their elders and their teachers, to denounce them and in a lot of cases put them to death. That Mao later turned around and that used that same power against them. That this, and part of the reason I'm saying this because this is an old story within
Yes.
conservatism. Is that I think it comes from Burke. I could be wrong. I know it comes out of the French Revolution. Revolutions eat their own children. That the very people who are now, granted, you do have your Lenins, your Stalins, your Maos. You do have someone at the very tip top of the pyramid, but the degree to which the revolutionaries who destroy so much are also destroyed and eaten themselves. And I think you see this, you see in Russia, you saw it in France, you see it in China. And I don't even know if there's a question there so much. It's just it's such a, you use this word cruelty, and this is something you would understand better than I would, but there's something about an authoritarian, totalitarian approach. It's not enough to just stamp out the enemy. You have to dehumanize them, and you have to get them to believe that they are subhuman, and then you can get about killing them. And to me, it's like, I don't even know what your word to use to describe that level of evil.
Yeah. Ugh. I I try to heal from that part of my culture as well. Because when I compare different cultures and different histories, and I'm not a history buff per se, but when I think about European history, there's Renaissance. I think there's periods of history in the West where people realize that humanity really matters and it's a good thing that people should hold on to. But in China, it's just one emperor after another. And emperors are pretty sociopathic. They have no compassion. And there's only, right now, the autocrats, only a handful of people in the world could experience that kind of power. And I don't have any wishful thinking. Like, I don't think Mao had any sort of compassion in him. So our culture is very, by and large, shaped by these sociopaths. And never did we have a Chinese Renaissance. A lot of, when people talk about, and don't get me wrong, I'm proud of the civilization. I'm proud of the culture that we've built as a nation over
Right.
thousands of years. But there's so much wrong about it. And it's not because the Chinese people were bad or anything. It was just the system, the power, the overwhelming power that those emperors, those sociopathic autocrats had over the rest of us. And they kind of imposed this very dehumanizing culture, which was reinforced over and over by their regimes, right? So it's a really hard part of our culture that I think me, myself, personally, I'm still trying to reconcile with that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't want to make the entire interview this heavy. It's good that we talk. And part of the reason I wanted to bring this up is because to whatever degree, Mao's dead, he's not in charge anymore. The Cultural Revolution, or at least that aspect of it, isn't in the history. But I think it's needful to talk about it because I think it says something about an authoritarian regime when they go to the extent they do in China to rewrite or ignore history rather than to address it. And that is, of course, the area where I think is most familiar to us in the West anyways, is the Tiananmen Square massacre. And we hear this a lot, but I want to hear it from you. Like, what are the odds the average school child in China would ever hear about Tiananmen Square? And if so, what would they learn about it?
Nothing. There are different categories, different levels of mistakes that the Chinese Communist Party has made. Some of them you can lie about, you beautify it, you put a filter on it, you spin it. And Cultural Revolution is one of them. The Great Famine is one of them. The mistakes that Mao made, I don't want to call them mistakes, because mistakes imply that mistake implies that he didn't do it intentionally, but he made every single choice intentionally. But Tiananmen Square is something that just simply cannot spin. They cannot put a filter on it. There is no excuse, and it happened so recently that it's hard for them to do so. So when I did I think it was my third interview on YouTube, when I did my third video on YouTube, the bots were going crazy because it's so much more sensitive than Cultural Revolution. I mean, for Cultural Revolution, you have films. A few years ago in Toronto International Film Festival, there was a film that was focused on Cultural Revolution. The Chinese Communist Party is a little bit more tolerant on subjects like that. But when it comes to Tiananmen Square, they go absolutely crazy because they know this is their most sensitive spot. And my generation, so it happened shortly before I was born. My generation probably heard a little bit about it from their parents. like I said, a lot of our history was passed down by spoken words, by family members, anecdotes. But the younger generation, the TikTok generation, they truly know absolutely nothing about it. And trauma is not something that you sit down at dinner table and talk to your children about. It's not something that I think even in our culture, right? Like we don't want to talk about those kind of things to our children, especially in a Chinese culture. So it just gets forgotten by people, and it's kind of sad. So I really want to. I hope people who are aware of it, no matter where they are and what kind of language they speak, I hope they could help to educate the younger generation because it's so important.
And to that end, it occurred to me I got this a little backwards. Could you very briefly
Yes,
explain what happened?
right. Um, it's a massacre, so it's interesting because the government believed that it was a time for reform, again for the good of the party, so that they could continue to stay in power. And there was economic reform and political reform. So the government, as we know today, they continued the economic reform, but they really had a hard time executing the political part of the reform. And the students, I mean, they're young, right? They want change, they want revolution, they want a better world for themselves and for the generations to come. So they protested. They wanted political reform, they wanted democracy. And what does democracy mean? It means that the Chinese Communist Party won't have the dominant power. They won't be the only ruling party. So they decided to put an end to the political reform. But so they have a stalemate, I guess. Like the students didn't want to give up. They didn't want to give in. And I want to emphasize the very person that ushered this economic prosperity for decades to come for China was also the same person who ordered the soldiers to commit murders against its own people. And it's something that the Chinese Communist Party, sorry, this is a little bit longer. And it's something the Chinese Communist Party used to justify that killing, is that they say it's a right decision that they made to kill all those students, because then that's the price you get for prosperity, for the continuity of the economic reform.
So let me pivot just a bit. I've heard you express in some of your videos a question yourself about why the Western world takes certain stances in trying to extend the olive branch to China in the way that it does, allowing them to join the WTO, for example. And this is a really big topic and it's very controversial. So I'm going to do us all a disservice of trying to summarize this as best I can. I'm just going to say, let's say here in the United States in the 1970s, in the Nixon administration. This, of course, was the very famous. The United States opened the doors to China. Henry Kissinger, the Secretary of State at the time, had developed this theory. This was very controversial. There are a lot of my heroes on the right who thought it was a terrible idea. But I can respect the strategy, and it was sort of twofold. The first was, look, if we could make some sort of inroads with China, we might be able to peel them away from the Soviet Union. Because between the two, the Soviets are the greater threat. They're the big nuclear power. They're potentially threatening war in Eastern Europe and maybe the whole continent. In an effort to avoid World War III and end the Cold War, let's try to make some sort of progress with China. Now, we can have a big debate. Was that a good idea or a bad idea? It's at least worth talking about. If this, geopolitical, that's probably the problem, is that you always have to kind of side with people you ordinarily wouldn't in order to determine the bigger threat. I mean, heck, we were siding with Stalin against Hitler, not that longer beforehand. The other argument is that we have observed in the West that, generally speaking, the more you can open the door of economic liberty, the more political liberty eventually follows. And we've seen that, and Russia may, in fact, be kind of an odd test case, even though it's a bad example because they're currently under the Putin system. But under Gorbachev, he had attempted some reforms. The problem was he was unwilling to do what so many authoritarian dictators did, which is murder their own citizens when they demand more. And when you start to give them a little freedom, the whole system falls apart. Authoritarian regimes can't survive like that. And so the theory was sort of, look, if we embrace China and if we encourage it in the direction it appears to want to go of embracing some sort of free markets, ultimately what that means is it will become more and more and more stable, more civilized, more likely to join the free world.
Mhm. I've
And
heard of that before, yeah.
yes, and so this is and part of the problem here is maybe all that's true. It's just we're talking about a 50, 100-year timeline, and we just don't know yet. Who knows? But I guess that's kind of my question is like, what is your general sense of that? Is that an ill-fated idea, or could that actually work?
I think it's mostly impossible. I think it's wishful thinking, and I think, if anything, history has proven me right. I think, okay, so if we take it step by step, right? Like embracing China to the free world, to the free, to WTO, the free trade agreement, it's under the assumption that we would collaborate more with China. And I think it's just a tiny bit arrogant to think that when we do that, when we open the bridge, we are going to be the one who's influencing China and not the other way around. At the time, a lot of people were so confident about, especially when the internet happened, right? Like I think,
I think it was the Clinton administration, yeah, I
right,
believe around then.
right.
We America just won the Cold War. Nothing bad was ever going to happen again. I mean, we were on
A lot
cloud
of
nine.
confidence, yes,
Yeah.
a lot of confidence, and people didn't believe China could. It was a free internet. Information is coming. They can count their days. There's so much confidence in the power that the democratic world would have on China, but nobody even thought about what a rising authoritarian power could do to the rest of us. And right now, I think I read a report, the world has become more authoritarian than it was before. So I think we really underestimated what China could do to the rest of us. And I think China is never going, just because China had joined the free trade, and they would play ball. They would tell you that, oh, the political reform would come after the economic reform, because that's the lie, right? That's the facade.
Right.
But they never ever, like, that's their bottom line. What is their bottom line? It's power. It's they have to stay in power. They have to be the only ruling party in China. That's their bottom line, and they will never give that up unless you force it upon them. And that's not gonna be with carrots. Like, they're not gonna be like, oh, you give something beneficial to us, and we're going to change for your benefit. That's not gonna happen.
So let me, and again, to push back on that, let me ask. I think it is perfectly reasonable to suggest if the West is just really, really nice to China and does good things for them, it would be pretty silly to think the CCP is going to give up power. However, it's a different thing to say, but if the Chinese people get a taste of liberty, economic liberty, what are the odds they could eventually demand political liberty?
I think they already did. A lot of people did. A lot of business people wanted more freedom, and they didn't even want to get into all the messy political issues. They wanted more freedom to earn more money. But the Chinese Communist Party just won't have it. I mean, you look at, it's just the way it's structured. The company is structured. You have to have a party member once you rise. Once the company's gets big enough, you have to have a party member to kind of monitor your activities. By law, you have to hand in your information. I mean, it's right to assume that when you have more money, you have more capital, you want more freedom, you want more power, and it's natural to think that, and it's right to think that. A good example is Jack Ma. He wanted more power. He flew. People say he flew too close to the moon, and then he disappeared. He disappeared, and nobody knew where he was. That's a fine example of how just the logical steps in people's mind don't necessarily follow in reality in China in this case.
Yeah, that makes sense. And much like every good conversation I have, I'm going to have twice as many questions as what we're reasonably going to cover in the hour. But I wanted to get this in here just because it's so present of mind. You're going to have to help me with the pronunciation here. My Chinese is, yeah.
I'll do my best.
I'm an Okie, Oklahoman. Who is the college professor you've done some videos about?
Jiang Xueqing.
Okay. Should I just call him JX? We'll call him.
Sure.
He is all he's all over social media these days. And before I even found your videos, I found some of his and giving this very fascinating lecture about how apparently we could just print all the money we want, nobody would be poor anymore.
Okay, so we live in a world in which banks can print out money, right? So now let's ask ourselves a question. Wait a minute here. If the banks can print as much money as possible, why do we have poverty? Right? Because we can just give money to poor people and they wouldn't be poor anymore. Why do we have poverty? Why? Okay, so we don't have limited resources, we have scarcity, okay? Right? So that is the common answer, scarcity. We have poverty because of scarcity. But I already told you this. They can print money out of nothing. So money is infinite. Money is an infinite resource. So why do we have poor people then? That's kind of strange.
Money just used for trade. They still have limited resources, and the actual means.
Okay, so you see what's happening is this. You all believe money is scarce, okay? I just spent the past 10, 20 minutes explaining to you, it's not scarce, it's infinite. It's just a number. We can at any time print out as much money as we need, okay? So that's how power works. Power has brainwashed you into thinking something that is not true. You've been taught from the first day that money is scarce. But it's not scarce, it's infinite. And no matter what I say to you, you still believe this, okay? So you have to get that out of your head. Money is not scarce, it is infinite. So let's go back to the question. Why is there poverty in this world? Why do people starve? Why is there inequality in this world? Why are there poor people? Why are there rich people? What's the answer?
Because they don't print infinite money.
Okay, because it's scarce. So guys, this is amazing, okay? You guys can't get out of your head. You think money is scarce. You think it is not possible to print infinite money, when I already told you it is possible to print infinite money because they do this all the time. Yeah? Yeah, because we don't want people to all have money. The powerful people don't want that. That's exactly the answer. And why? Because otherwise, no one would work. Do you understand? The point of putting money is not to give you money. The point of putting money is to create the illusion that money is valuable, and therefore you work hard in order to obtain it. But in order for me to make you want to get money, I need to create artificial misery. Do you understand? Right? If there weren't poor people, you wouldn't want to be rich. It's only because you see people suffer that you would want to go make money for yourself. What do your parents tell you? Your parents tell you, work hard in school, make a lot of money. Otherwise, you're going to end up like a poor person. Right? Well, guess what? If there are no poor people, your parents couldn't say that to you. And you wouldn't want to work hard in school. Right? That's why we have poverty. Because poverty creates the illusion that money is valuable. In other words, poverty isn't what you do to yourself, it is what the powerful do to you.
That's the appropriate reaction. Yes, it's
Oh, it's
anyhow.
terrible. Oh my God.
I don't even know where to go with the colossal stupidity of that statement, but you had done some interesting videos because it looked like at one point this dude was pretty critical of the Chinese government. And so what happened?
It's really not uncommon to see someone who's critical of the CCP, and then they switch sides. We've actually seen that happen a lot in this year, like in 2026, in the Chinese YouTube world. A lot of people in Chinese we use this word 招安. It basically means you're compromised, you're recruited by the Chinese Communist Party. And the Chinese Communist Party love a good story like this. They love to turn people. They don't want people who are always for the party is great. They want to turn you around, and it gives them so much more satisfaction and legitimacy. Because the fact that he was critical of China, I think in a way makes him more believable to a lot of people, because people assume that that he changed because he's objective. Maybe that means China is not that bad. And China understands the value of turning someone like that. And it could be, in this case, it could be a combination of state power and personal difficulty. Maybe I don't know, it could be like he just realized it gives him more traction on the internet by talking up about China. It's really not that uncommon, especially for, I think, second generation Chinese immigrants. Maybe they grew up adopting a very different ideology. They believe that they are the injured party here, they're wrong, they're the minority. And then they look at China as someone to look up to, some kind of like their homeland in a way. And inevitably they're going to, again, put a filter on it, right? Like they're going to think that China is better than what it really is. And it offers a certain level of familiarity to them. And I think Zhang Shuqun embodies that personal story, because he immigrated to Canada, had a really tough, according to his own words, very tough upbringing, very humble family. And yeah.
Has China made any attempt to reach you?
Yes. I actually made a video about it. I knew that was going to happen. So I actually talked a little bit in my video too. I want to do this for a long time. And I remember when I did my first video, I knew this day would come. I prepared myself as much as I could. I think still right now I'm a small fish. But if I get bigger, they will try everything they can. And I'm not saying that because, oh, this is what's in my head or anything. Like, it happened to a lot of people, and people are I'm not the only brave person here. I don't think I'm that brave, but like there are people who in the Chinese world, again, there's just such an invisible wall here between the English YouTube world and the Chinese YouTube world. But there were people who were approached by CCP recruiters, and they recorded the whole conversation. Of course, the conversation is in Mandarin, and the way they go about it, it's very strategic, it's very smart. Of course, there's money, but there's also a lot of negotiation skills that they implement when it comes to persuasion. So yeah, I think if I get bigger, that's definitely going to happen.
Is there anything? I hope you get bigger, because I
Yeah,
think the
thank
message
you.
is important. But if and when that day comes, is there anything you fear about it?
I hope I won't be compromised. I hope I still remember the very first video that I made. I hope I remember the reason why I'm doing this. The only thing I'm scared about, other than the people that I love and I care about, because they go after your family and stuff, but also I hope people would believe me, because I'm just only one person. The dissident community is so small and fragile and vulnerable. And I fear that people would, with the power of TikTok, with this, with the Chinese Communist Party backing all these fake influencers on the internet, I hope we would be able to outshine them, because the opposite would be really bad for everybody, for all of us.
This would be an excellent segue for kind of a closing conversation, but I would be remiss if I didn't. Right, you mentioned TikTok multiple times, so I would feel odd if I didn't give us an opportunity to go down that road. And I want to ask about more than just TikTok, though that is obviously important. Well, let's start there. We'll talk about TikTok, and then I want to ask a follow-up question about the general information warfare within China. But it's a big debate here in the United States or in Western nations. Should we just ban the darn thing? What is the actual risk of TikTok? Is it dangerous for Americans to be posting so much information on that social app?
There's so many things that are dangerous about that platform. National security being the top one, and I think political propaganda. There's so many research, so many reports have been done to support that argument. This is a Trojan horse. This is a way for the Chinese Communists. I don't want to sound melodramatic, but this is one of the ways that the Chinese Communist Party is able to influence domestic politics in the U.S. Right, and I think the national security risks. And I actually interviewed a Canadian. Well, now he's in the States. Ironically, he got a job in the States, but he's a really good Canadian national security expert, and he talked a little bit about obviously the risks of having such companies. I don't expect ordinary Canadians and Americans to think about that. I don't expect, when TikTok is on your phone, you can download it on your app store. I don't expect people to think twice about it, because most people won't. I expect the country, the government, to do something about it, because that's why we have a government, right? Like to protect us all. And I think for that reason alone, it's very dangerous, because you don't have necessarily the support that a government in a democratic country normally needs. Because if anything, the business community are all against it, as far as I know, because it's a huge
Against shutting it
platform.
down, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's unfortunately yes.
So I don't, I think it's dangerous in a way that it's so hard to shut down, and the Chinese Communist Party knows that. I mean, if this was the other way around, imagine if this was an American company operating in China. In an authoritarian regime, it is gone the next day. You know what I mean? It's so easy for them to do that, but it's so hard. You have to go through these meetings, and I'm not saying like it's bad. Like that's the reason I moved here.
Sure.
I love that we have a democratic process, but it's also the downside is like when you need to make that decision, it is very hard, and it takes such a long time.
So let me ask you then, because a very common critique I hear among my friends in the West is it's not so much that they would deny that the CCP is gathering information from apps it owns like TikTok, but they would basically say, well, but what difference does it make? Like, I'm on Facebook, I'm on Twitter, I'm on TikTok. All of these companies are gathering information from me. And some of them say, I'm more concerned about what the executives at Facebook know about us that are, these radical left-wing loonies that are trying to destroy the United States. So I just want to ask you, a Chinese dissident, why should
Yes.
the average American be more concerned about the CCP than other social media company information gathering?
You know what's interesting? I asked the very same question to my national security expert in my interview with him. Not because I believe what they believe, but like I just think that's a fascinating question. Well, for one, the Chinese company, ByteDance, it's a foreign company, and that should be all the answer someone needs. It's a foreign company. It's not just a foreign company, it's a foreign company owned by a hostile nation, an authoritarian regime. I think that's really alarming that people don't care about that. It makes all the difference. In America, you could still sue. I understand they're a big tech company, but they're still somehow governed by American laws, right? Like you can't do the same with the Chinese company. This is my expert told me, it's funny that people think that they care about you personally. They don't care about your data, what you ate,
Right.
in the morning. That's not what they're looking for. They're looking for data. They're looking to gather all the data and attack you. And it's just so, people are just so, they don't understand it's not about you personally. It's about you as a country, which you're a part of. And yeah, like it's very dangerous. Like people should be really more alarmed by this.
So I think something that you and I had discussed briefly before the interview when we talked before this, you would confirm a suspicion or something I had heard before, which is that the manner in which the CCP appears to be engaged in information warfare or information gathering is different than what most Americans are used to. Usually, what we're used to is Russians or North Koreans that use this information to attempt to shut down a power grid or blackmail a company or cause some sort of direct, immediate harm. And I'm not saying that the Chinese would not do that, but that their strategy appears to be a little different in that it is more about obtaining information that they could use at a later date, even if in this present moment they don't know exactly how. And there's probably a better way to put that, but help
No, yeah.
unpackage that for me. Is that a fair way to summarize it, or how would you put that?
I think that's a really good way to put that, in that, you know, we are a civilization with long history of education. We probably have a little bit more long-term goals when it comes to influence. It's really funny because there's this ultimate debate about the Chinese Communist Party, whether they're short-sighted or they focus on long-term goals. I think when it comes to grasping and maintaining power, they're very short-sighted. But when it comes to cognitive warfare, when it comes to influence your perception, they really do play the long game. And like you said, they gather all the information. They stay low key. They're not loud about it. They lie about it. But they're always ready to attack. I think that's actually a really good way to put it.
Okay, we have limited time. There's tons more I could ask you, but I want to try to wrap up here. I'm going to read here a little section from a book. This is essentially the depth and the extent of my Chinese knowledge comes from the Book of Tea, written before World War II by a Japanese dude. So already we're in trouble. But as I enjoy tea, so sometimes I'm cool like that. I'll drink tea in the evening and read my Japanese tea book. But he writes here, and he mentioned something about China found very fascinating. I want to get your take on it. He said, it should be remembered in the first place that Taoism, like its legitimate successor Zennism, represents the individualistic trends of the southern Chinese mind in contradistinction to the communism of northern China. And again, this is a reminder, this is written prior to World War II.
Mm-hmm.
Of northern China, which expressed itself in Confucianism. So he's juxtaposing Taoism and Zennism in southern China, and then Confucianism in northern China. The Middle Kingdom is as vast as Europe and has a differentiation of idiosyncrasies marked by the two great river systems which traverse it, the Yangtze and the
Yellow River?
Hango Ho. Maybe it's the yellow. We'll say it. Again, my Mandarin is terrible, but with the two great rivers, which are respective, and he juxtaposes those with the Mediterranean and the Baltic, referring to the European people.
Okay.
And he says, even today, in spite of centuries of unification, the southern Chinese differs in his thought and belief from his northern brother, as a member of the Latin race differs from the Tetuan race. And again, that is written a long time ago, but I know cultures are slow to change. And I guess I'm curious here, is it still true that the northern and the southern Chinese have a slightly different mindset?
I think it's more than just northern China and southern China, but more coastal China, inland China. And it's less of, Taoism or Confucianism. I think it's just, for example, Hong Kong is in the southern part of China.
Right.
They're very international. Shenzhen is very international. Shanghai is very international. During COVID, right? I think the white paper protest, I believe it started in Shanghai. So people are more receptive, I guess, to Western values, democratic values in those cities because it's a different culture. And for provinces like, well, it's a city, but provinces like Sichuan province is southern China, but people are very for unity. They're very traditional, but it's southern China. So I think I'll politely disagree with that author who probably has passed away.
I would say so.
I think modern China, like people, like right now, the Chinese people, it really depends on how you grew up and how much you are exposed to the outside world, less than your geography, like whether you're northern or southern China. But that's an interesting take.
And I probably should have prepared you for that quote ahead of time so I could ask more interesting questions off of it. The reason I bring it up, though, is I'm a Burkean conservative, which is, as Burkeans are not the only ones who believe this, but in a sense that liberty is often grafted within the culture. It's hereditary in a sense. It's a gift to be maintained from one generation to the next. Yes, we can believe in Lockean ideas of liberty, of, all men are created equal and that we have rights, and that's wonderful. But how do we defend that? How do we make those grow? How do we enrich it? We look back to our history, things we're proud of. And as a result, oftentimes when a conservative wants to imbue a people group with liberty, they look to their culture and they try to determine what in this culture is conducive to ordered liberty. And some cultures have an easier go at it than others. And so when I read that, it makes me, because again, in my American brain, when I think of China, I just think it's all the same. But I know that's not true. I know it's very diverse. And I'm wondering if there, and part of what I picked up on in that, you mentioned Hong Kong, I picked up on that too. Well, Hong Kong's in the south, Beijing's in the north, and obviously there's a lot in between those two. But it made me wonder, are there pockets of China that the culture is less beholden to not only the CCP, but let's just say centuries of authoritarian rules by emperor? And maybe that's leading to my next question, which is what is your hope for China? I know that Taiwan stands out there as if, yes, democracy is possible, but if it were possible, is it something that you believe would need to spring up first in pockets of the country?
I think pragmatically, yes. I arrive at that conclusion, but not because I believe there are pockets of cultures or subcultures in China that are more conducive or just more adaptive for democracy, but because there was this book that The Rise and Fall of the East, written by a great Chinese American scholar. He talks about how in Europe, a lot of democracies is the result of scattered governance, I guess, because they're smaller, so it's easier for them to have a democracy. And I kind of agree after reading that book, because we kind of already see that, right? Like when even right now, like Hangzhou is a city in China, and a lot of people say they're very different from the rest of the country because they have a lot of autonomy in a way. But I think, I think if it does happen, and I don't think it's going to happen in my lifetime. I think in my lifetime, we're going to be able to see the collapse of the Chinese Communist Party, if we're lucky. I was more sure of it 5 years ago, but now I'm not so sure. But to see democracy in China, I think that's a stretch. But if we're so lucky, I agree, it would happen in a scattered place, like in a very small place in China that probably somehow breaks away from the rest of the country. And then maybe China would be divided into 4, 5, 6 parts, and they all govern their own country or their own province or something, and just they turn more democratic because it's just better for everyone.
And I think in part you've answered my closing question, but I want to go ahead and let you take a stab at this, because Saving Elephants, of course, my podcast is all about trying to call the Republican Party back to conservative roots. it's a very discouraging process sometimes because it seems like over the 8 years I've been doing this, the GOP has just gotten further and further into a cult of personality and nationalist populism and all sorts of things that I don't think are conducive to limited government, let's say. But then I look at someone like you and I think you've got a lot harder project, than what I would. And so I want to ask you, because you're out there behaving very bravely, not only in the sense of it's, of what could happen, but also just that it's difficult. I think it's an act of courage to dare to have hope. When so much around the world looks like it's just hopeless, I think it takes courage to say, no, maybe it is hopeless. I don't know what the future holds, but darn it, I'm going to do my part, And so I want to ask you, because you're out there, you're putting these videos together, you're trying to help us Westerners understand China. What is your hope? You kind of alluded to this, that maybe not in your lifetime trying to be this grand, thriving democracy, but what do you think is realistic in, let's say, our lifetime? What do you hope for?
Resist the silent invasion of the Chinese Communist Party. I hope that people would wake up and realize that maybe we had too much confidence when we opened the world to China. And it's really time, especially, and not to get into domestic politics because I've always been treading very, very carefully, but especially people on the left, to realize that don't underestimate authoritarianism, not just domestically, but also, where its origin is. Like countries like China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, do not underestimate the power that they have on you just because you grew up here, you were born here. Doesn't mean that everything will stay the same. And I think focus on domestic politics all you want, but just keep in mind that China is not your friend. And the regime, is actually really, really dangerous. And my hope is that I'm not even hoping for a democracy in China at this point. I just hope the rest of the world don't get dragged down by this regime and don't get destroyed along the way.
That's sobering. And Lou, thank you for the work that you're doing. And thank you for taking the time to come on the Saving Elephant Show.
Of course, it's my pleasure.
Thanks for listening to the Saving Elephants podcast. Be sure and subscribe for future episodes. Do you have a topic or question about conservatism, millennials, the Republican Party, or anything else that you'd like us to cover in a future podcast? We would love to hear from you. Email us at savingelefantsblog@gmail.com. That is savingelefantsblog@gmail.com. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and catch our weekly Friday blog posts at savingelefantsblog.com. That is savingelefantsblog.com. Join us next time as we reignite conservatism for millennials.